Good afternoon. Three paintings created by Italian artists, Leonardo, Raphael, Correggio, within a 40-year period, are the subject of this lecture. They could hardly be more different in appearance, each from the other. I will begin with the most famous among them, one of the central works of Italian and world art, Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, painted between 1495 and 1498, in tempera and oil, mixed media, more than 15 feet high and nearly 29 feet wide, 4.6 by 8.8 meters. It is in the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. I will only sketch the biography of Leonardo in Milan. He was born in 1452 in Vinci and was therefore about 30 when he settled in Milan at the invitation of Ludovico Sforza, who ruled as regent. For more than a decade, he worked as an engineer, a designer, a decorator, a sculptor, and even as a painter, because in 1494 Ludovico became Duke of Milan and soon commissioned Leonardo to paint a mural of the Last Supper in the refectory of the Dominican monastery attached to the church of Santa Maria delle Grazie. This church was being rebuilt under the direction of the great architect Donato Bramante to accommodate the Sforza family mausoleum. So Leonardo's painting had added importance. He was in his mid-40s and in the full maturity of his art when he created his masterpiece. The Last Supper of Christ with his disciples the night before his arrest was the appropriate subject often painted on the end wall of a refectory, the dining hall of the monks, an opportunity to meditate upon its significance while they ate in silence or while another monk read from the scriptures. The painting and the subject are both widely known, yet much always remains to be learned and especially to be seen. I want you to look hard at this image while remembering its great size, about 29 feet wide, which is essential if you are to imagine its impact. Part of that is due to the perspective construction of the painted upper room in which the supper was held, because it looks almost like an extension of the refectory itself. I know some of you will have seen it, and I know that those who see it have different opinions about its effect, its impact. For me, the impact is visceral. The figures seem to push toward you. Leaps off the wall is too violent an expression, but when I am there, I am overwhelmed by the inexplicable sensation of urgent physical presence. Now, part of that is their size, the apostles, yet we see only their upper bodies. The table presses against the front plane of the picture, and the apostles are almost literally bound to the table. They press against it, lean upon it for support, seem to be part of it. And that is as it should be, for this table, this supper, was the Jewish feast of Passover, of deliverance, which for Christians from this night onward, through the suffering and death and resurrection of Christ, became their salvation. I said from this night onward, because this Christian Passover, as it has been called, began at this supper when Jesus announced his imminent betrayal. Verily, verily, I say unto you that one of you shall betray me. In other paintings of the supper, the apostles sit calmly in quiet conversation or meditation. Even when they respond to the prediction of betrayal, it's with simple expressions of disbelief. That's because the artist, in that case, and his clerical patron wanted the brothers to meditate on the sacrament of the Mass, the Eucharist, which originated with the Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples. The great drama of Leonardo's reenactment is unprecedented, not because he ignored the sacramental, he did not, but because he first and foremost wanted to show the full range of human reactions to Jesus' statement, and he found for each apostle a specific character-revealing response, whether anger or astonishment or fear or devotion or doubt, self-doubt. The intense agitation of the apostles produces an outward surge, left and right, from Jesus in the center. Scanning the row of heads, we see a wave-like movement, now cresting, now ebbing, contained by the two apostles at the ends of the table. 6 figures on each side of Jesus are subdivided into unified groups of 3. At the center of this scene of consternation is Jesus, a pyramid of fortitude and calm. Let's look closely at 6 of these apostles, beginning with those to the immediate right of Jesus. A study in contrasts. The figure with broad chest and outstretched arms is James Major, a militant personality. Standing to the right of him is the speaking, almost pleading Philip. And the figure who is reduced to only a head and a hand is the most remarkable. His face is closest of any apostle to Jesus, and his striking hand, forefinger pointing straight upward, is interposed between them. He is Thomas, doubting Thomas, whose probing finger later verified the physical resurrection of Christ, while here, pointing to heaven, it is a harbinger of the physical ascension. Thomas is both dramatic actor and theological symbol. Now to the immediate left of Jesus. Here we find Peter, John, and Judas. This is the critical part of the drama. John leans away from Jesus in order to listen closely to Peter, who urges him to ask Jesus, who is it who will betray him? And Leonardo has made the traitor, Judas, part of this group. But he shrinks back and is the only apostle who makes no assertive, reactive movement. We recognize him by his inaction and by his shadowed face, and of course by the bag of silver pieces, the betrayal payment, clutched close in his right hand. His head is lower than any other, his body smaller. He literally shrinks from the words of Jesus. Jesus is framed by the large central window of 3 of this upper room, which look onto a mysterious mountainous landscape. Now, Leonardo's space is constructed on perspective principles, and one would anticipate that the converging lines, the orthogonals as they're called, of a one-point perspective construction would meet at a single point in the distance which we would expect to find in the landscape. Except that Leonardo had here decided to use perspective for expressive purposes primarily, and all the perspective lines of the ceiling and the tapestries, the darkened tapestries that you can hardly recognize as such on the wall, follow those lines and all the lines of the ceiling, and they all converge on the head of Jesus. This, despite the fact that those lines run to the rear of the room while he is seated near the front. He is silent, sad, submissive, a nearly motionless anchor amid the tumult. It is an open, direct pose in which slight gestures convey meaning. His right hand extends toward Judas's left hand, accusing him. Only John's folded hands separate the hands of Judas and Jesus. The hands of Judas and Jesus are strikingly similar, but antagonistic. In the Gospel of Luke, he has Christ say, "The hand of him that betrayeth me is with me on the table." And at the same time, the right hand indicates the glass of wine, the symbol of his blood used in the Mass, while his left hand extends toward the bread, the symbol of his body. These Eucharistic symbols lie at the corners of the base of the stable equilateral triangle of Christ, a triangle that surely symbolizes the Trinity, and therefore the submissive human figure of Jesus is also the incarnation of the divinity. This expresses the dual nature of Christ. Was Leonardo capable of giving form to complex theology in an unexpected eruption of human drama? You bet he was. There is genius, and then there is genius, and then there's Leonardo. Such complexities may also have been discussed between Leonardo and theologians associated with the Dominicans in the monastery or the Duke's advisors. And here's another remarkable fact to ponder. Christ's right hand, gesturing toward Judas, is palm down. His left hand is palm up. These gestures almost surely reflect images of the Last Judgment, where the upward palm of Christ signifies salvation and the downward one damnation. But it's always the right hand that saves and the left hand, sinister, that condemns. Why is it reversed here? It has been proposed, first I think by the Leonardo scholar Leo Steinberg, that the reversal is connected with the Sforza mausoleum at that moment being incorporated into the nearby church. If you project a perspective line from Christ's left hand into real space, that perspective line meets the refectory wall at a point where a door once existed. It continues through the door, across the cloister, and ends at the tribune of Santa Maria delle Grazie, within which the tombs were to be. Thus, the upward palm of salvation had to be the left hand. This is a far-reaching interpretation, especially stated bluntly, but it deserves serious consideration. The painting has been badly treated in the past 500 plus years, including by Leonardo. He worked slowly, and so he was not a fresco painter. He painted the Last Supper in a mixture of oil paint and tempera on this end wall, outside of which was nothing to protect it against cold and the damp which would seep through. His paint did not adhere well to the wall and was deteriorating even during his lifetime. The mural was neglected, subjected to damaging early restorations, and even vandalized. You cannot have missed the loss of a large portion at the lower center, where in 1652 a doorway was cut through the wall, taking with it the feet of Jesus and much else. As can be seen in old copies, prints particularly, his feet were unusually posed. We wouldn't know this except for those copies. The feet were very close together, very close, under the table and on the receding center line of the pavement, of the tile. That line could easily be read vertically because it goes straight in, and the closely pressed feet could have suggested Christ's feet on the cross. That this survived the Second World War is a miracle, since the bombing of the refectory, a direct hit, left it without a roof from 1943 to 1946, while the Last Supper was sandwiched between sandbags in a steel armature, awaiting its resurrection. Both the long decay of the painting and its most recent restoration, 21 years, it was restored from 1978 to 1999, both this part of the history and old and new are well known, and in fact almost too well known, because that knowledge has preconditioned visitors and blunted the experience of encountering the painting freshly, especially now that the masses, that's all of us, have arrived and you don't get half an hour with it. This is a masterpiece that fortunately did not rely solely on perfection of color and surface. It is a great pictorial invention that embodies a profound concept of humanity and theology, and therefore has never ceased to compel other artists to emulate it by copy and paraphrase, to try to absorb its power. It echoes unceasingly through the subsequent history of Western art. If you see the Last Supper today, don't lament what is lost. Don't speak or listen. Open your eyes and try to comprehend the glory of what remains. Raphael's Baldassare Castiglione will be our second painting, painted in 1514-15, oil on canvas, about 32 by 26 inches. It is in the Louvre. Born Raffaello Sanzio, or sometimes Santi, in 1483, the spelling Raphael, always used in English-speaking countries, is derived from the Latin form of his name, which he sometimes used as a signature. Born at Urbino, he worked in Florence and later in Rome until his premature death. He painted noble frescoes in the Vatican's papal apartments. He created memorable images of the Madonna and Child, and he was a distinguished portrait artist. My choice of his portrait of Baldassare Castiglione is certainly not meant to slight his other great achievements, but to single out what I consider to be one of the greatest portraits of the Renaissance or of any time. This portrait is the convincing and memorable image of a self-confident, robust man who seems to be the embodiment of the ideal of Renaissance humanism, a person whose intellect and emotions are in perfect harmony and under the control of wisdom. Raphael knew Baldassare Castiglione well, and contemporaries agreed that the portrait was a living example of the ideal courtier, which he was. So it may be helpful to know more about Castiglione before talking about the portrait. From 1504 until 1516, he had been closely associated with the court at Urbino, a renowned cosmopolitan, cultured, intellectual milieu. Castiglione was employed principally in military and diplomatic services, but he was also an intimate at the court, a privileged friend of his princely employers. In 1508, Castiglione conceived the idea for a book that would relive one of the most remarkable features of this fortunate court, the conversations that took place during after-dinner gatherings of the court and guests, discussions that lasted late into the evening on all manner of topics, light and amusing or serious and contentious. In his idealized reinvention, Castiglione turned those conversations into literature, and the result was, of course, the world-famous The Book of the Courtier, soon translated into English, French, German, and Spanish, and published in 108 editions by 1616. Those ruminations continue to surprise and delight us, not only for the probing intellect and wit on display, but also for their civility. Like the courtly ideal about which Castiglione wrote, to my eyes, Raphael's portrait is a nearly flawless example of the artistic ideal that evolved and peaked between about 1490 and 1520, most famously in the works of Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. This ideal achievement, which we call the High Renaissance, was a grand and harmonious integration of form and content. At once aesthetically refined and highly intellectual, it flared and was gone within the lifetime of Raphael himself. This portrait's restrained and yet luxuriant palette is a consonance of gray, black, and flesh tones. The black, especially the wonderful hat, stands out against a grayish gold background. In the palpable sleeves, the grays shift from silver gray highlights to dark slate shadows. The white, bright white shirt front anchors the center. His gray beard is distinguished from the other grays by its detailed texture. His skin is warmly ruddy, the eyes clear blue. The drawing is superb, especially the incisive contours and the distinctive hat. Let your eye run around the hat. It is clear, by the way, that Raphael had seen Leonardo's Mona Lisa and is indebted to it for his pose, which was new then. But he edited out almost everything but the figure itself. Since there's no descriptive background and no props save a glimpse of a chair arm at the right, Castiglione's half-length figure itself must create the space. Indefinite shadows of his hat and torso are cast on the background, but the illusion of space must be between that ground and us. That is the job of the volumetric modeling of the figure that simultaneously organizes the painting's space and characterizes the sitter. The full figure and the ample sleeve accomplish this beautifully. Originally, the hands would have had a more important role because they were completely above the frame, as was a little more of the chair arm. At some date, the painting was cut down at the bottom by about 4 inches, about 10 centimeters, which is why I said nearly flawless. Still, we are left with these perfectly defined and balanced volumes and a persuasive description of the man we have met, a man of intelligence and judgment with the added gift of friendship. Look at this painting and one word may come to your mind: poise. When this was painted, Castiglione was in Rome as ambassador from Urbino. His early acquaintance with the young Raphael in Urbino had now deepened into friendship, and it shows, I think, in the unreserved directness of the Count's eyes and the ease of his pose, and the communion between sitter and artist now includes us. Another of his close friends, the noted poet Vittoria Colonna, read the manuscript of the courtier, and she wrote, "I'm not surprised that you have described a perfect courtier, since you had only to hold up a mirror before yourself and consider your external and internal qualities." End quote. Better than any mirror, Raphael has captured this courtier's external and internal qualities. This is one of the touchstones of great portraiture. It was often copied to serve as a model and inspiration for other painters, some of them great, but no one would improve upon it. Our third painting is by Correggio. It is Jupiter in Io, painted about 1531-32, oil on canvas. It is now in Vienna in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. Antonio Allegri, known as Correggio, from the northern Italian town of his birth in 1494, did his most ambitious work in Parma, where he took spatial illusionism to a new level of daring in his dome frescoes in the cathedral and in the Church of St. John the Evangelist. He also painted some beautifully colored and expressively composed altarpieces, but the painting we're looking at is perhaps the most extraordinary among his easel paintings in a very different vein: erotic nudes painted in a soft, flowing brushwork. Jupiter and Io was commissioned by the Marchese Federico Gonzaga for his palace in Mantua. Correggio had earlier painted similar erotic mythologies for this patron in the mid-1520s, and now was asked to paint a series of mythological paintings depicting the loves of Jupiter, at least 4 of which were completed. It is quite relevant that the Gonzaga family considered Jupiter their mythical ancestor, and that Federico had his own, shall we say, reputation to celebrate. Ovid, whose poetry informed Botticelli's Primavera, retold the myth of Jupiter in Io in the Metamorphoses, and that was the inspiration for Correggio. Io was spotted by Jupiter as she was returning home, and he suggested that she escape the midday heat in a shady grove. But perhaps she'd heard that line before, and she ran away. Since words had failed him, Jupiter, quote, spread darkness over the wide earth, concealing it from view. Then he halted the maiden's flight and robbed her of her maidenhood. And that is exactly what we see. Jupiter, enveloped in a dark cloud, gradually envelops Io. When you first see this painting, you may not immediately see Jupiter within the cloud, and actually it's less quickly apparent in the large painting in the museum than it is in reproduction. It's a supreme piece of illusionistic art, this gradual revelation of a head and hand within the cloud. His head appears just behind and slightly above hers as he kisses her, not yet on the lips, though many writers say so, and his right hand is pressing into her side. Her arm wraps around a portion of the cloud corresponding to his arm, as she acquiesces to his insistent presence. It's a very tall, narrow format and was probably dictated by the place it was to hang. But Correggio utilized it brilliantly with the downward spiraling cloud continued in the serpentine body of Io. Great erotic art was also painted by Titian in Venice, but Correggio's eroticism differs from Titian's, not in the degree of physical sensual reality, but in the evocation of the sexual response. Jupiter and Io is so frank in its suggestion of sexual climax that it has no parallel in Renaissance painting. It is intense and exact. Look at her face. And especially at the tensing of her left foot from the toes up and the spasm in her right toes. But, and this is essential, it is at the same time so poetic, so tender, so melting, that it could never be called pornographic. And there was a good deal of pornography created in the Renaissance. Because Correggio's unquestioning nature accepted the erotic as part of being human, he could alternate easily between pagan and religious subjects. And indeed, his eroticism warmed some of his religious paintings. Although his subtle technique must have owed much to the example of recent Venetian painting, which was already widespread across northern Italy, the most likely source of his melting brushwork is Leonardo, whose sfumato, literally smoky, style was powerfully influential, especially in Milan, which Correggio could have visited often. He may have seen The Last Supper, and he certainly saw many works by followers of Leonardo. Many of them let their sfumato run to inky blacks, but Correggio infused his palette with exquisitely nuanced tones and colors, even in a literally dark painting like this one. His modeling results in the palpable, caressable quality that is so irresistible to the eye and the tactile sense. The remarkable sinuous pose of Io seems clearly derived from a figure of a muse designed about 1518 by Giulio Romano, a Raphael protégé, for a fresco in the Villa Farnesina in Rome. Correggio never visited Rome, so he either saw an engraving or, even more likely, could have been shown a drawing of that figure by Giulio Romano himself, since from about 1525 to 1532, Giulio was engaged on a major architectural and painting project for Federico Gonzaga in Mantua. Giulio and Correggio, contemporaries then in their 30s, must have had many opportunities to exchange ideas. Seen in the context of the 1530s, Correggio's new note of gentleness, softness, and embraceable poetic realism contrasts with the often nervy line and neurotic temperament so common among contemporary Mannerist painters. And after his premature death in 1534, such qualities were rarely seen for half a century. I must not omit the observation always made about this aspect of his art. If it had no immediate followers, both the eroticism and the brushwork seem to anticipate the paintings of Fragonard and especially Boucher, the great French 18th century sensualists. By the way, the story of Jupiter and Io did not stop with the embrace. Juno, the rightfully jealous wife of Jupiter, glanced down from above and wondered why the earth was blanketed in dark clouds on such a bright day. She naturally looked around for her husband, and not finding him, she descended to earth and parted the clouds. Sensing her approach, Jupiter had quickly turned Io into a white heifer. The reason the whole story is in Ovid's Metamorphoses. Juno, not fooled, asked for the lovely cow as a gift, and Jupiter, ashamed, which never rings true in his case, handed Io over to Juno. That is another story, which you may read in Ovid and see in many paintings. Thank you for your attention.